Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you all for your willingness to serve. As Chairman Dodd said, I have some specific questions for Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, Madoff victims are deeply concerned about the recent actions by SIPC, and in particular by the trustee, Mr. Picard. And I want to ask you about some of those concerns. First, they are concerned about the speed with which Madoff victims have been repaid, with many of them still not paid and some of their claims actually being litigated. What's your view of the progress or lack thereof that SIPC has made in taking care of Madoff victims?
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Obviously, we're all well aware of the complexities when you're unwinding these complex corporate vehicles. I think SIPC has been operating in what I would call deliberate speed. The ability to really be able to kind of get your arms around all of this process on a worldwide basis is going to be, a considerable job. I do think that there are going to continue to be concerns as we move forward, because many of the issues that we're dealing with in the Madoff matter are going to be those of first impression in large part. But I think that SIPC has what I would call the track record of showing that it has the ability in handling what I would call large-scale activities. In particular, I just previously mentioned the handling of the Lehman Brothers situation, which was large in scope and in breadth, and feeling fairly confident that we'll be able to move forward with deliberate speed in terms of taking care of investors.
If you speak to the Madoff victims, they don't particularly have that view. And I'd like to elicit from you a commitment that if you are confirmed by the Senate, that you will meet with a group of representatives of the victims to get a different view about where SIPC is and listen to what their concerns are, so that as the chairman, you might very well have an opportunity to improve where we're headed here.
Mr. Menendez, you do have my commitment on that. I believe in order to be successful in this area, you have to be willing to take all points of view. As mentioned earlier, one of the things that we will have to also take into consideration is whether or not the rules and regulations that we currently have in place provide the adequate safeguards. And it's been a number of years since we've had a chance to take what I would call a full-scale view of the laws that support SIPC, and I think that's one of the first orders of business as well.
I appreciate it, and we look forward to your review of it and any responses we need legislatively to help you do the job. Let me ask you, Madoff victims are concerned about how SIPC has used clawback litigation to retrieve money from victims to contribute to the general pool for victims' funds. In your view, should SIPC use these clawbacks, and if so, under what circumstances?
It's difficult to really come to a final conclusion on that. Obviously, many of the issues regarding clawbacks and things of that nature are still being handled by the courts. But I will say that I think the primary goal of SIPC will always be to do what's necessary for the protection of all investors that are involved, making sure that we're not in a position where we're simply protecting those that may have been early to the game as opposed to those that haven't come at a much later point in time. I do think that there has to be a certain sensitivity as you deal with issues of this nature. One of the things that we want to make sure is that we're continuing to follow the rules and regulations that we have, and also be willing to figure out how to be flexible whenever possible, because obviously the definition of the organization by its nature is to be involved in the protection of its investors. So from a clawback provision standpoint, I think that's something that will have to continue to be looked at. I haven't had a chance to see what I would call all of the confidential and internal workings of how these decisions were made, but in taking into consideration the final rulings of the court and then having an opportunity to look at those issues, I'm hoping to be able to draw some fairly adequate
Well, I hope you and, as for that fact, Ms. Bowen, are going to look at this also, the whole question of what in essence is the net equity. It just seems to me we're in a position where victims find themselves even further behind the process as it is unfolding. And, it's a difficult situation, and maybe, yes, to some degree, that of first impression, but, it just seems to me that the victims shouldn't ultimately be further victimized because of a process that ultimately puts them in a worse position than they should have or would have been. And I really, I'll send you some questions, both of you, on that issue. I'd like to have your responses in writing as it relates to that.